Welcome, everyone, and a special welcome to you, Professor Brandom. I'm very happy to have you here, even if it's not in real Amsterdam. But I'm very glad that you could make it online and that we have this possibility, at least this possibility to talk, to hear you and to discuss things with you. So the Dean, Professor Fred Weerman, is going to introduce you and welcome you officially to the University of Amsterdam.
Thank you. It's an honor to welcome Robert Brandom as our 2021 Spinoza Chair. And if I count correctly, Professor Brandom is in fact our 25th Spinoza Chair holder. So this online inaugural speech, the Rortyan Pragmatist master argument, is both a premiere and an anniversary. And talking about the history of this chair, Richard Rorty, figuring in the title, is not only one of Professor Brandom's teachers, but he is also his predecessor as a Spinoza chair holder in 1997. Hegel plays a prominent role in Professor Brandom's next talk, that is lecture next week. And I'm sure Hegel would have been invited by our philosophy department for the Spinoza chair too, if the faculty would have been a bit older, or if there would have been any possible world for such an event. Robert Brandom is one of the best known and most original philosophers of language, working also in the field of the philosophy of mind and philosophical logic. He is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh, a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a Fellow of the British Academy. Brandom earned his BA in 1972 from Yale and his PhD at the age of 27 from Princeton, under David Kellogg Lewis and Richard Rorty, as just mentioned. Brandom is an exceptional philosopher for several reasons. First of all, he is a creative, renewing, innovative thinker in systematic philosophy as well as in the history of philosophy. Without exception, the many books he wrote all express an incredible degree of Bildung. Robert Brandom was never very interested in the divide between Analytic and Continental philosophy, but instead interested in reading everything which could help him to develop his own original thought. Therefore, revival of Hegel in analytic philosophy, in conversation with philosophers like Rorty, Sellis, McDowell, Dummett, and of course, Jürgen Habermas, who were all reading philosophers from both sides of the divide. This certainly contributed to his pragmatist interest and approach. He reinterpreted the philosophy of language and led it away from the formalistic and technical form which analytic philosophy of language had dominated since Frege. Instead, Brandom wanted to articulate the normative and action-oriented dimensions of language, give expression of the normativity of inferences in order to understand the meaning of sentences. Brandom is one of the very few philosophers who still attempt to develop a theory of everything, a theory in many different subdisciplines such as logic, philosophy of language, epistemology, ethics, and the meta-theory of how they all belong together. Finally, the moral and political implications of Professor Brandom's thought become more and more timely in our times of crisis. Brandom never ceased to believe, with Sellers, that participating in a society is a game of giving and asking for reasons, a game of reciprocal justification of our action. Post-truth relativism is just as alien to his thinking as an authoritarian dogmatism. His general goal to rescue an objective normativity stands not only in the best tradition of Hegelianism, but also in the name giver of our lectures. The aim in studying the objective nature of things for Spinoza, as for Robert Brandom, is freedom. An online Spinoza lecture is new for us. Last year, the lectures were cancelled in our first confrontation with the pandemic. Although we all sincerely hope that next year's lectures will be in the Lutherse Kerk again, it's good to see how we survive. And I think it's also worthwhile to point out that this year's Spinoza chair is a real online specialist. As you can see for yourself when visiting his website, which is linked to his YouTube channel. Professor Brandom, literally the expression doesn't make sense anymore in this online stage, but it's an honor to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Dean Wehrman, and it's a pleasure to be here, as you say, this, whatever that means exactly, for us to be together. Generations of German philosophy students were taught early on that they face an ineluctable, existentially defining choice, Kant oder Hegel. The thought was not that one needed to pick one or the other of these seminal, difficult, multifarious philosophers to concentrate on and master. It was that, struggle as one might, one would inevitably find oneself allied with one or the other, conceptually, methodologically, and even temperamentally, and that the difference would resonate beyond one's conscious control throughout one's thought, affecting the topics one found it important to address, the tools one used to do that, the manner in which one proceeded, and the standards to which one held oneself. If they got a bit further, the students would learn to line this question up with the more focused one, Verstand oder Vernunft? This is asking whether one organizes one's thought and philosophical aspirations according to the meta-categories of scientific understanding, or of the more exalted and self-reflective reason, in something like the sense that Hegel gave this originally Kantian distinction. If the students didn't get that far, the question would still live on for them in the form of a vague background concern with how seriously to take the Romantics' critique of Enlightenment. Though he never himself put the point this way, I think a useful way to understand the basic principle animating the two books in which Richard Rorty first found his distinctive philosophical voice, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature from 1979 and The Consequences of Pragmatism from 1982, is as applying a sophisticated form of this Kant oder Hegel framework to then contemporary analytic philosophy. So construed, the critique and the diagnosis of the ills of the kind of philosophy he found himself immersed in at Princeton, that's developed at length in Mirror, condemn it for its Kantianism. When at the end of that book, in a phrase he came not only to reject, but to regret, he prophesied the death of philosophy, the quintessential anti-essentialist explicitly defined what he meant by the term philosophy, what he thought we could and urged we should no longer go on doing, as the sort of thing that Kant did. And the new kind of pragmatism that Rorty proposed to replace that sort of philosophy is evidently and avowedly Hegelian in spirit, albeit inspired by the naturalized, but still social and historical form of Hegelianism that he admired in Dewey and self-consciously emulated in his own work. Later, Rorty would applaud the broadly naturalistic, sociological, historicist impulse that he saw Hegel as having bequeathed to the nascent 19th century, and would speculate about how much further we might have gotten by now if at the end of that century, Russell and Husserl had not, each in his own way, once again found something for philosophers to be apodictic about from their armchairs. Rorty's idea of the form of justification for a recommendation of a way forward always was a redescription of where we've gotten to, motivated by a Whiggish story about how we got here that clearly marks off both the perils already encountered and the progress already achieved along that path. This is the literary genre that Rorty is an undisputed master of. He said that already during his Chicago years, quote, Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, Whitehead's adventures of ideas, and Lovejoy's The Great Chain of Being gave me a taste for ambitious, swooshy Geistesgeschichte that I've never lost. This taste was gratified in later years by such writers as Etienne Gilson, Hans Blumenberg, and above all, the later Heidegger. My taste for synoptic narratives has sometimes made me think that my real métier was intellectual history, and I might have been better off in that discipline than in philosophy. That's the end of the quote. Those quotes are all on a handout that you should be able to find in the chat section. Rorty here acknowledges his appreciation of the literary genre that Hegel both brilliantly practiced and centrally thematized, putting Hegel's distinctive new master metaconcept of recollective rationality at the center of his own approach. It might seem that bringing the Kant versus Hegel conceptual framework to bear to illuminate the state of Anglophone philosophy in the last third of the 20th century was no great innovation and required no great insight. After all, hadn't that tradition already pugnaciously divided itself into analytic and continental camps that more or less lined up that way, with a more narrowly professionalized research discipline using technical definitions and formalized arguments to address problems construed as perennial and an epistemological focus on empirical science on the one side, and on the other, a more broadly intellectual, thoroughly historicized, self-consciously hermeneutic pursuit, more interested in literature, art, and politics. But I think further reflection undercuts simply lining up these movements with Kant and Hegel. It's true that it was the continentalists and not the analysts who continued to read Hegel. But among the towering figures in that tradition, Husserl decisively identified himself with Kant rather than Hegel, and Heidegger had quite complicated attitudes towards both figures, unified in the end by his violent recoil from and vehement rejection of the pair of them and all they stood for. In any case, the broadly Hegelian project Rorty was then recommending as an alternative to the degenerating Kantian research program he saw in analytic philosophy didn't look to Europe for its inspiration, but to the substantially distinct tradition of classical American pragmatism. At least equally radical and surprising is the reimagined, redescribed, and revived pragmatism that he developed as a constructive therapeutic response is Rorty's remarkable diagnosis of the ills of analytic philosophy as resulting from an uncritical and so undigested Kantianism. For Kant emphatically was not a hallowed hero of that tradition. Anglophone analytic philosophers thought that the Kant oder Hegel question simply didn't apply to them. After all, Russell and Moore had read Kant out of the analytic canon alongside Hegel, believing, correctly I think as it's turned out, that one couldn't open the door wide enough to let Kant into the canon without Hegel sliding in alongside him before that door could be slammed shut. Both figures were banished, paraded out of town under a banner of shame labeled idealism, whose canonical horrible paradigm was the Bradleyan British idealism of the absolute, from which those codifiers of the analytic paradigm, having been acolytes early on, were recoiling. So in diagnosing 20th century analytic philosophy as constrained by conceptual bounds put on it by Kant, philosophy in the mirror of nature was in fact taking a remarkable and original line, offering a retrospective redescription and reconceptualization that was both disquieting and disorienting. The dominant self-conception, pugnaciously made explicit by Carnap, was of analytic philosophy as an up-to-date form of empiricism, a specifically logical empiricism, whose improvement on traditional pre-Kantian early modern British empiricism consisted in the much more sophisticated sort of logical tools it deployed to structure and bind together essentially the same atoms of preconceptual sensory experience to which the earlier empiricists had appealed. To see why and how Rorty blamed Kant for what he saw as the calamitous state and degenerating research program of analytic philosophy in the second half of the 20th century, one must look more closely at the arguments of philosophy in the mirror of nature. Its most focused target is epistemological foundationalism. Rorty saw epistemology as unable to escape the Agrippin trilemma. Attempts to justify empirical knowledge must either move in a circle, embark on an infinite regress, or end by appeal to unjustified justifiers, which must accordingly supply the foundations on which all cognition rests. The animating thought is that justifying, by inferring conclusions from premises, can only transmit antecedently possessed positive justificatory status. So the first two options lead to skepticism about justification. On the third, foundationalist option, two kinds of justificatory regress threaten. For when a set of premises is appealed to in justifying a conclusion, one can inquire further about the warrant either of those premises or of the implication of the conclusion by the premises. The two sorts of regress stoppers Rorty saw appealed to were immediate sensory experiences as ultimate justifiers of premises and immediate grasp of the meanings of our terms or the contents of our concepts as ultimate justifiers of inferences. In a telling phrase, he refers to these as two sorts of epistemically privileged representations. Rorty takes Kant at his word when Kant says that what he's doing is synthesizing rationalism and empiricism. But Rorty also takes it that what logical empiricism made of Kant's synthesis in the end takes over both sorts of privileged representations, the sensory given from the empiricists and the rational, logical, inferential, semantic given from the rationalists. This is one sense in which Rorty diagnoses Anglophone philosophy as still in thrall to Kantian commitments. In this story, Carnap shows up as a neo-Kantian malgré lui, though it's not at all how he thought of or presented himself. That's also how Rorty's hero, Wilfrid Sellars, regarded Carnap. Perhaps the revenant neo-Kantian philosophical spirit of Heinrich Rickert, passed on through his student Bruno Bauch, Frege's friend and colleague and Carnap's Doktorvater, was just too strong to be wholly exercised by the empiricist rites and rituals practiced by the Vienna Circle. In any case, in rejecting both sensory givenness and meaning or concept analytic inferential connections, Rorty relies on the arguments of two of Carnap's most important and insightful admirers and critics, Sellars in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, and Quine in Two Dogmas of Empiricism, respectively. Tellingly, Rorty finds a common root in their apparently quite different critiques. Sellars and Quine, he sees, both offer ultimately pragmatist arguments, which find the theoretical postulation of such privileged representations to be unable to explain cardinal features of the practices of applying empirical concepts. Rorty then widens the focus of his own critique by deepening the diagnosis that animates it. The original source of foundationalism in epistemology, he claims, is representationalism in semantics. Thinking of the mind in terms of representation was Descartes' invention, but the idea was brought to a new level of sophistication by Kant. He codified representation as the semantic genus of which both sensory intuitions and inference engendering concepts are a species. And he certified our epistemological privileged access to both under the still residually Cartesian slogan, "Nothing is better known to the mind than itself." It's perhaps ironic that in digging down beneath epistemological issues to unearth the semantic presuppositions that shape and enable them, Rorty is following Kant's example. For Kant's argument, culminating in the refutation of idealism, was that once we understood how to respond to the threat of semantic skepticism about the intelligibility of the relations between representings and what they represent, there would be no residual issue concerning epistemological skepticism about whether any such representational relations actually obtained, whether things were ever were as we represent them to be. In the end, I think that while Rorty's objections to foundationalism are made pretty clear in the text of his book, the rationale for laying responsibility for this epistemological view on semantic appeal to the concept of representation are less so. But putting together clues he offers us, an argument for seeing the necessity for two sorts of objectionably privileged representations is already implicit in the idea that the mind's cognitive relation to its world is representational, might be reconstructed along the following lines. The starting point is the Cartesian idea that if we're to understand ourselves as knowing the world by representing it, there must be some kind of thing we can know non-representationally, namely our representings themselves. On pain of an infinite regress, knowledge of representeds mediated by representings of them must involve immediate, not mediated, that is non-representational knowledge of at least some representings. Our non-representational relation to those representings will be epistemically privileged in the sense of being immune to errors of misrepresentation. This is the representationalist analog of the justificatory regress on the side of premises. Next is the thought that when we ask about our knowledge of the relation between representings and representeds, another potential regress looms if we're obliged to think of this knowledge also in representational terms, that is, as mediated by representings of it. This is the representationalist analog of the justificatory regress on the side of inferences. On this dimension, too, appeal to immediate non-representational access to representational relations seems necessary. The pair of threatened semantic regresses, one on the side of relations and the other on the side of their relata, exactly parallels the pair of threatened epistemological regresses invoked by the Agrippan trilemma. Along both dimensions, the threat of an infinite regress seems to force a choice between foundationalism and skepticism, depending on whether we invoke something known immediately and non-representationally, or allow that mediation by representings goes all the way down. Rorty saw that according to such a picture, the epistemological choice between foundationalism and skepticism is already built deeply into the structure of the semantic representational model. Looking back years later in his intellectual autobiography, Rorty said, quote, "I still believe most of what I wrote in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, but that book is now out of date. I vaguely sensed that the trouble with analytic philosophy was that it had never advanced from Kant's eternalization of the intellectual situation of 18th century Europe to Hegel's historicism. But I had not yet made myself sufficiently familiar with the post-Hegelian European philosophers who had resisted the temptation to go back to Kant, zurück nach Kant, as the Neo-Kantians did." End of the quote. I think Rorty became dissatisfied with Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature's strategy of arguing against representationalist paradigms and semantics on the basis that they force an epistemological choice between skepticism and foundationalism. He never wavered in his view that finding oneself in that epistemological predicament demonstrates the need for radical conceptual revision of one's semantic model. And he continued to believe that the concept of representation was so burdened by ultimately epistemological baggage that a completely new start was needed. But his strategy for delegitimizing representational semantic models changed. He realized that, as a matter of sociological fact, concern with epistemological skepticism and foundationalism were not, in fact, central orienting concerns of the analytic philosophy of his day, centered as it was by then on the philosophy of language. During the last decade of his life, he formulated a new line of attack, seeing anti-representationalism in semantics as a version of anti-authoritarianism. This more overtly political line both drew on and in an important sense brought to a logical conclusion the evolution of his thought in the intervening decades. This is the argument and the development I want to consider in more detail here today. He introduced the new idea, in his June 1996 Ferrater Mora lectures at the University of Girona, entitled Anti-Authoritarianism in Epistemology and Ethics. In connection with those lectures, he was encouraged to invite discussants of his choice, and I was privileged to be among them, along with my colleague John McDowell and the Norwegian philosopher Bjorn Romberg, whose sympathetic yet penetrating reading of Davidson had deeply impressed Rorty. One memorable extended discussion during those happy days led to a consensus among us about how three of our positions should be understood in relation to one another. We all agreed that if one found oneself obliged to choose between epistemological skepticism and epistemological foundationalism, then somewhere well upstream something had gone badly wrong conceptually. Shifting the metaphor, we came to think of that predicament as a bottomless abyss that must be avoided at all costs. Rorty's view was that one put oneself severely at peril of falling into that chasm as soon as one permitted oneself to think in terms of the philosophical concepts of experience and of representation at all. Though he conceded that these philosophical concepts were progressively and productively employed beginning in early modern times, he took it that we were now in a position to see where their use inevitably led, free fall into the abyss, doomed to oscillate endlessly between skepticism and foundationalism. To keep us safe, Rorty thought, a protective fence needs to be erected sufficiently far from the edge that the temptation of the dilemma would not even be visible from the safe side of the fence. His radical proposal then, as already in Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, was that both concepts must be given up once and for all. For Rorty, a principal virtue of the sort of pragmatism he endorsed and developed as a successor framework is that it had no need and no use for the traditional concepts of experience and representation in talking about how what he called vocabularies help us cope with the vicissitudes of life. As he thought of it, pragmatism carves out an entirely different conceptual path from the modern philosophical tradition that grew up around those concepts. He sums up his anti-representationalist linguistic pragmatism in the pithy slogan, "Language is for coping, not copying." Rorty thought that if it were possible for the concept of experience to be rehabilitated, if it could be purged of its Cartesian contagion, then surely Dewey would have been the one to bring it off. Dewey, after all, had worked tirelessly to give experience the processual, interactive, ecological sense of Hegelian Erfahrung, rather than the atomistic, episodic, self-intimating, epistemically transparent Cartesian sense of Erlebnis. Erfahrung is the sense in which, as Dewey says, it's perfectly in order for a job advertisement to specify no experience necessary. That's not intended to be read in the Cartesian sense that would invite applications from zombies. But Dewey signally failed to get the philosophical and generally cultured public to shake off the Cartesian associations of the term experience. And his own practice degenerated to the point that, as Rorty said, thinking especially of Dewey's practice in experience in nature, he ended up using the term experience as merely an incantatory device to blur every conceivable distinction. Rorty remained convinced that Dewey had been right to eschew representation talk as giving aid and comfort to the sort of static, spectatorial, intellectualist mind is the mirror of nature view that fetches up in the skepticism foundationalism dilemma. Romberg agreed with Rorty on these basic points. And I was entirely of his mind as far as the concept of experience is concerned. Outside of explicitly Hegelian contexts, where it figures in his conception of recollective rationality, experience is not one of my words. It's not, for instance, used, but only mentioned in the many pages of making it explicit, even where topics such as perceptual knowledge are addressed. I agree that the associations and correlated inferential temptations entrained with the term experience go too deep to be easily jettisoned, or even for us to succeed in habituating ourselves completely to resist them. The light of day neither abolishes the shadows nor stays the night. The expressive powers making things discursively explicit wields over what is implicit are real, but they're not unlimited. we're on the whole better off training ourselves just to do without the notion of experience. But by contrast to the notion of experience, it seemed to me then, and seems to me still, that things are otherwise with the concept of representation. Now, there are many things one might mean by anti-representationalism. When I use the term representationalism, I mean a particular order of semantic explanation. It starts with some notion of representational content, reference, extension, or truth conditions, and understands proprieties of inference in terms of such already representationally contentful contents. Those contents must accordingly be assumed to be theoretically and explanatorily intelligible, antecedently to and independently of the role of representations in inference. Representationalism in this sense contrasts with what I call inferentialist orders of semantic explanation, which begin with a notion of content understood in terms of role and reasoning, and proceed from there to explain the representational dimension of discursive content. I recommend and pursue inferentialist rather than representationalist semantic explanations. But not giving representation a fundamental explanatory role in semantics doesn't disqualify it from playing any role whatsoever. It seemed to me in Girona, and it still does today, that a suitable pragmatist explanatory strategy, beginning with social practices of using expressions to give and ask for reasons, could unobjectionably both underwrite theoretical attributions of representational content to some locutions, and also underwrite the viability and utility of the common sense distinction between what we're saying or thinking and what we're talking or thinking about. That is, representing or describing by saying or thinking that. So it seemed to me that a distinction should be made between the reprobate, irremediably tainted concept of experience, which I agree should be banished from careful philosophical discourse, and the prodigal, errant, and potentially dangerous concept of representation, which might still be tamed, rehabilitated, sanitized, and reintroduced to perform carefully supervised productive labor in a newly hygienic guise. In the image we all found useful in Girona, I thought the fence keeping us from sliding into the abyss of foundationalism or skepticism could be located much closer to the edge than Rorty did. Although, by contrast to the notion of experience, the concept of representation is not the particular focus of McDowell's mind and world, he was and is convinced that both concepts can be relieved of the excess baggage of associations that, McDowell agrees, can and have made them principal villains, enticing philosophers to their doom down the path that leads to the skepticism or foundationalism dilemma that Rorty convincingly diagnoses. And Rorty and I agreed that McDowell had successfully brought off the feat of disciplining a notion of experience to the point where it can do crucial philosophical work without falling into Sellers' myth of the given. Given that remarkable achievement, it's no surprise that the relaxed way in which he invokes the representational dimension of empirical concept use also manages not to be philosophically theory-laden in a way that leads to the trouble Rorty diagnoses. I think it helps here that McDowell shares with Rorty a Wittgensteinian version of the pragmatist anti-metaphysical conviction. That conviction entails that calling on really any concept to do heavy lifting in philosophical explanations of some supposedly puzzling phenomenon, such as the possibility of genuinely knowing how things visibly are, is infallibly a sign of deep antecedent conceptual confusion in understanding the situation that seems to call for such a philosophical explanation. In any case, as a result of his resolute rejection of the impulse for deep metaphysical explanation, McDowell doesn't think that offense is necessary to avoid the abyss at all. If we're just sufficiently careful with our use of the concepts of experience and representation, cutting them free of entanglement with dubious and ultimately disreputable metaphysical, epistemological, and semantic programs motivated by what turn out to be ill-posed and ill-considered questions, we can keep carefully circumscribed versions of the ordinary language terms around and use them as necessary in philosophical clarifications. He shows that that's possible, McDowell does, by skipping merrily along the very edge of the foundationalist precipice, sure-footed as a mountain goat, never putting a foot wrong or seeming to be in danger of losing his balance. Rorty and I agree that McDowell succeeds in bringing this off. But we want to say, kids, don't try this at home. This man is a skilled professional. It's not as easy as it looks. The balancing act can indeed be brought off because he can do it, and he does it. We thought that prudence nonetheless dictates the erection of a fence to protect the unwary, the less careful and less skilled philosophical public from what remains a dangerous temptation. McDowell seemed to us not to be sufficiently concerned about the danger to those less capable than himself. I think here of Edinburgh, which stringently enforces a legal prohibition on jaywalking, which is illegal if and only if it's done within the sight of anyone under the age of 12. Risk your own life, the thought is, but don't encourage the young and impressionable to follow suit. McDowell, we felt, insufficiently appreciates the practical wisdom of Edinburgh rules. This three-sided discussion in Girona was in many ways a satisfying survey for us all. It usefully rehearsed and fixed our general locations in philosophical space, along with the hopes and suspicions that motivated them. At the end of it, Rorty told us that what we would hear about in his immediately upcoming lectures was a new line of argument against representationalism. It took the form of a recharacterization of the lesson and significance of the pragmatism that he had all along aimed to establish as the principal rival of and ultimate successor to the pervasive representationalism of the day. According to this new way of pitching things, what pragmatism aims at, beginning already, if only incipiently, with the classic American pragmatists, is nothing less than a second Enlightenment. The picture of the original Enlightenment that he takes over as the fixed end of his analogy follows directly Kant's characterization in Was ist Aufklärung. The Enlightenment marks the end of humanity's self-imposed tutelage, the achievement of our majority and maturity, for the first time taking adult responsibility for our own character and destiny. It's our emancipation from submission to the alien, non-human, because superhuman authority of old nobodaddy in matters of our practical conduct. Henceforth, we should deem it incompatible with our human dignity to understand ourselves as subject to any laws other than those we have in one way or another laid down for ourselves. No longer should our ideas about what is right and good be understood as having to have been dictated to us by a superhuman authority. The deep Enlightenment insight was the diagnosis of what Marx, following Hegel, would later call fetishism, concerning the practical norms we acknowledge and identify with as making us what we are. Fetishism is mistaking the products of our own practices and practical attitudes for features of the objective world that are what they are independent of and antecedent to those practices and attitudes. Marx's favorite example was the traditional conception of the value of precious metals, which thought of the value of metals the same way it thought of their density. So that there was, for instance, an objectively correct answer to the question of how many ounces of silver are really worth as much as 1 ounce of gold. The first Enlightenment, as Rorty construed it, concerned our emancipation from non-human authority in practical matters, issues of what we ought to do and how things ought to be. The envisaged Second Enlightenment addresses rather our emancipation from non-human authority in theoretical cognitive matters. Here, the non-human authority in question is not that of God, but of objective reality. The philosophical conception Rorty liked to write with a capital R. In an essay published in English a few years after the Girona lectures, called Pragmatism as Anti-Authoritarianism, Rorty summarized the view that he had announced there. He said, quote, there's a useful analogy to be drawn between the pragmatist's criticism of the idea that truth is a matter of correspondence to the intrinsic nature of reality, and the Enlightenment's criticism of the idea that morality is a matter of correspondence to the will of a divine being. The pragmatist's anti-representationalist account of belief is, among other things, a protest against the idea that human beings must humble themselves before something non-human, whether the will of God or the intrinsic nature of reality. He adds that seeing anti-representationalism as a version of anti-authoritarianism permits one to appreciate an analogy that was central to John Dewey's thought, namely the analogy between ceasing to believe in sin and ceasing to believe in reality. The connection is that, quote, the representationalist tradition in philosophy, which was dominant in those 400 years, hoped that inquiry would put us in touch, if not with the eternal, at least with something which, in Bernard Williams' phrase, is there anyway, something non-perspectival, something that is what it is apart from human needs and interests. By contrast, quote, what Dewey most disliked about both traditional realist epistemology and about traditional religious beliefs is that they discourage us by telling us that somebody or something has authority over us. Both tells us there's something inscrutable, something toward which we have duties, duties which have precedence over our cooperative attempts to avoid pain and obtain pleasure. Again, quote, Dewey was convinced that the romance of democracy, a romance built on the idea that the point of human life is free cooperation with fellow humans, required a more thoroughgoing version of secularism than either Enlightenment rationalism or 19th century positivism had achieved. As Dewey saw it, wholehearted pursuit of the democratic ideal requires us to set aside any authority save that of a consensus of our fellow humans. Eduardo Mendieta says of the lesson of these lectures in his introduction to a collection of interviews with Rorty called Take Care of Freedom and the Truth Will Take Care of Itself, quote, in the end, Rorty's adamant skepticism and anti-dogmatism are simply ways to be anti-authoritarian and irreverently anti-fetishistic. There is no supreme power that can offer an alibi, warrant, or proof for our claims and beliefs, nothing except fallible human authority. There is no supreme authority other than the authority of human justifications and reasons, whose only power is the power of persuasion, end of the quote. Rorty's call for a second enlightenment is a Hegelian extrapolation of the original Kantian understanding of enlightenment, extending the application of that conception from ethics to encompass also semantics and epistemology. Later on, I'll say something about what makes it Hegelian and what difference that makes. But first, I think it's worth filling in the argument behind this subsumption of semantic anti-representationalism under the banner of humanistic Enlightenment anti-authoritarianism. In its largest structure, I think it consists of two moves: a Kantian appreciation of the normative character of representational relations, and a Hegelian social pragmatism about normativity in general. The first is part and parcel of Kant's radical recasting of Descartes' division of things into minds and bodies, in terms of Kant's distinction between norms and causes. Kant reconceives discursive intentionality, apperception, or sapience as a normative phenomenon. For him, what principally distinguishes judgments and intentional actions from the responses of merely natural creatures is their normative status. Knowers and agents are responsible for their judgments and intentional actions, for how they take things to be and how they make things to be. Candidate knowings and doings express commitments as to how things are or shall be. They're exercises of a distinctive kind of authority, the authority to commit oneself, to make oneself responsible. This is the authority to bind oneself by rules in the form of the concepts discursive beings apply in judging and intending. Merely natural creatures are bound by rules in the form of laws of nature. Discursive beings are bound by rules they bind themselves by, concepts they apply, which are rules determining what they've thereby made themselves responsible to and for. Their normative statuses, responsibilities, commitments, are instituted by their attitudes of undertaking or acknowledging those commitments. Autonomy is the essence of Kantian rationality. It's a distinctive normative sort of positive freedom, which Kant develops by turning Rousseau's definition of freedom as obedience to a law one has prescribed for oneself into a criterion of demarcation for genuinely normative bindingness. As we've seen, one of the principal grounds in which in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, Rorty condemns then contemporary analytic philosophy as still enthralled to Kantian conceptions is the central role that Kant gives to the concept of representation in understanding the contentfulness of thought and experience. In his later defense of anti-representationalism in semantics, on the basis of a more thoroughgoing and general version of Enlightenment anti-authoritarianism, I think Rorty follows Hegel in focusing on the rulishness of Kant's conception of representation. For Hegel reads Kant as offering a normative conception of representation as a way of filling in his normative conception of intentionality. Kant dug down below Cartesian epistemological concerns about the warrant for our confidence in the success of our representational undertakings to uncover the underlying semantic understanding of representational purport that they express. Where Descartes takes for granted the representational purport of our thought, construing it as something we immediately know just by having thoughts at all, he takes for granted our thoughts being, in his phrase, tanquam rem, as if of things. Kant wants to know what it is about our thoughts in virtue of which they so much as seem to represent something else, purport to point beyond themselves to something that they are of or about. One lesson Hegel learns from Kant, as I understand him, is that a representing is responsible to what it represents for assessments of its correctness in a distinct sense. What's represented exercises authority over what count as representings of it, just in virtue of its serving as a standard they're responsible to for such assessments of their correctness. This is a radical reconceptualization of the representational relations between representeds and representings as a fundamentally and essentially normative relation of authority and responsibility. As I want to understand Rorty's late anti-representationalism as anti-authoritarianism, his long-standing social pragmatism about normativity comes into play precisely because of this Hegelian normative understanding of representation in terms of the authority of objective representeds over subjective representings of it. Pragmatism in this sense is the claim that normative statuses, paradigmatically responsibility or authority, commitment or entitlement, that normative statuses are always and everywhere features of the role something plays in social practices. Norms are creatures of our practices, instituted by practical attitudes, how we take or treat things. Apart from their involvement in such practices, there are no normative proprieties, only natural properties. This is a social Hegelian version of a central Enlightenment idea. Samuel Pufendorf had theorized about what he called the imputation of normative characteristics of things, the way things acquire this new sort of normative significance by playing a suitable role in our practices. Social contract theories of political obligation looked for the origin of normative statuses of political authority and responsibility in practical attitudes of contracting and consenting. By contrast to traditional ideas of an objective natural or supernatural order of normative superiority and subordination, the scala natura, the great chain of being, by contrast, the modern idea is that there were no statuses of authority and responsibility no superiors and subordinates, until we started taking or treating each other as authoritative and responsible, as entitled to command or obliged to obey. As I understand the course of his intellectual development, Rorty's axial commitment to social pragmatism about normativity, which becomes explicit in the 1970s, was a product of his invention of eliminative materialism already in the 60s. That's why I describe social pragmatism about normativity as a long-standing view of Rorty's. As I would rationally reconstruct the chain of thought that emerged there, Rorty begins by thinking hard about the Cartesian conception of the mind in connection with Wallace Matson's question, why isn't the mind-body problem ancient? Rorty focuses on what it is that thoughts and sense impressions, such as images, have in common that could have led Descartes to assimilate such otherwise different items under the specially crafted heading of pensées, an assimilation that would have seemed absurd to earlier Aristotelians and to whose fraught consequences Sellers had sensitized him. The answer Rorty eventually came to, starting off from the rough popular characterization of Cartesian privacy, ended with the substantially more focused notion of incorrigibility. And that conception, Rorty put, in explicitly normative terms. The key, as he came to see it, is a distinctive kind of first-person authority. Sincere contemporaneous first-person reports, whether of pains or of thoughts, count as reports of mental occurrences, just in case and insofar as they have a distinctive kind of unoverridable authority. Understanding minds in the Cartesian sense accordingly shows up as the task of understanding the nature of that authority. One option is that the authority should be understood as a natural, objective, ontological feature of mental phenomena. That's how Descartes did. But Rorty had learned from the later Wittgenstein to be suspicious of this idea. Normative statuses, he thinks, must ultimately be understood as social statuses. That's a positive Hegelian lesson that Rorty learned from Dewey. To talk about something as possessing authority is to talk about the role it plays in some social practice. So faced with two possible orders of explanation, from ontology to social practice, that is, from attitudes of acknowledging and attributing authority that conform to and recognize antecedent objective normative statuses, and the other way around, normative statuses as reflecting the practical attitudes of participants in social practice, given those options, Rorty opts for the second. He's not prepared to think of the ancients as just having overlooked a key feature of the world, that nothing has the authority to contest sincere first-person reports of contemporaneous mental episodes. Rather, he thinks, social practices of according such authority to reports changed. Descartes both theoretically reflected and practically encouraged modern practical subjectivist attitudes of taking or treating sincere first-person reports of contemporaneous mental events as having incorrigible authority. That change in normative attitudes brought into existence a new ontological category of thing, mental episodes as incorrigibly knowable by their possessors. Those two commitments to demarcating the ontological category of Cartesian mental events by the normative status of putatively cognitive attitudes towards them, claims reporting them, and understanding such normative statuses as instituted by social practices, together entailed that a change in practice of the same general sort that had brought Cartesian minds into existence in the modern period could eliminate them going forward. This was Rorty's doctrine of eliminative materialism. It made his academic career as an analytic philosopher. For it was, along with the contemporaneous functionalism, of which it was a socially and normatively inflected variant, the first really original response to the mind-body problem in generations. It was the view in the philosophy of mind that corresponded to Nietzsche's historicist third way between theism and atheism. There once was a God, but when our social practices and normative attitudes changed sufficiently, He died. It was by our radically changing our practical attitudes that we killed him. Rorty acknowledged and embraced eliminative materialism as a pragmatist form of Hegelian historicism. He says, precisely because of his historicism, Dewey was, I believe, the classical pragmatist whose work will have the greatest utility in the long run. But the historicism about Cartesian mindedness is argumentatively downstream from the social pragmatism about norms that emerges in Rorty's thought already for the first time in the 60s. He's working with a distinction between two ontological categories of things, distinguished by the normative structure of authority that defines them. Cartesian mental things are what the attitudes of individuals have ultimate authority over. And social things, like discursive practices, are what the attitudes of communities of practitioners have ultimate authority over. And normative statuses, such as authority and responsibility, he classifies as social things. Because the ontological classification itself is defined in normative terms of authority structures, the category of the social is given pride of place as primus inter pares. Rorty's considered then and rejected objectivism about norms and so about Cartesian mindedness. This is the idea that the presence or absence of things defined by the normative authority of individuals or of communities is an objective matter, in the sense of being independent of the practical attitudes of individuals or communities. In his early eliminative materialism period, Rorty does not explicitly confront the status of the third ontological category of objective things, things about which neither individuals nor communities exercise final authority. The final stage of pragmatism, construed as anti-authoritarianism, is the completion of a second Enlightenment, is the result of applying social pragmatism about normativity to the ontological realm of objective beings, now themselves construed in normative terms of authority. According to Rorty's radicalized version of social pragmatism about norms, the very idea of objective things as exercising epistemic authority over our attitudes, underwritten by the semantic idea of represented serving as normative standards for assessment of the correctness of what count as representings of them, just in virtue of being responsible to them for such assessments, Rorty thinks is deeply and irremediably confused. For him, all authority is in the end communal authority. We can only genuinely be responsible to each other, to what we can engage with in conversation, to what we can give justifying reasons to, and in turn demand justifying reasons from. And this radicalization of social pragmatism about norms is now explicitly construed in political terms of freedom and dignity. Quote, only in a democratic society which describes itself in pragmatist terms, one can imagine Dewey saying, is the refusal to countenance any authority save that of a consensus reached by free inquiry complete, end of the quote. This is the standpoint from which growing out of acknowledging the overriding practical authority of an objective supernatural lawgiver and growing out of acknowledging the overriding cognitive authority of an objective natural represented reality came to seem to Rorty to be two sides of one coin. And it's a lesson he takes himself to have learned from Hegel via Dewey. He says, quote, this is because Dewey was the most historically minded, the one who learned from Hegel how to tell great sweeping stories about the relation of the human present to the human past. Dewey's stories are always stories of the progress from the need of human communities to rely on a non-human power to their realization that all they need is faith in themselves. They're stories about the substitution of fraternity for authority. His stories about history as the story of increasing freedom are stories about how we lost our sense of sin and also our hope for another world, and gradually acquired the ability to find the same spiritual significance in cooperation between finite mortals that our ancestors had found in their relation to an immortal being. End of the quote. The incipient pragmatist emancipation that Rorty's working towards is the substitution of a pragmatics of consensus for a semantics of representation. All we can do, he thinks, is give and ask for reasons with each other. Authority and responsibility are creatures of those discursive practices. We should accordingly reject the idea that our discursive practices answer to, are responsible to, need acknowledge the authority of anything outside those practices and the practical attitudes of those who engage in them. The constraint of the objective world on our practices should be understood as exclusively causal, not normative. Rorty was probably the most polarizing philosophical figure of his generation. And I think that the conclusion of the line of thought I've been rehearsing, distilled by him over 4 decades, is the root cause of the stark division into opposing camps of rabid Rortyphobes and adoring Rortyphiles. It is, of course, iconoclastic to attack the modern picture of the mind as the mirror of nature, to seek to dethrone the dominant representational conception of our cognitive relations to the world. But semantic representationalism, pervasive and philosophically powerful though it might be, is pretty dry stuff, of interest principally to specialists, as is the crisis of epistemological foundationalism, which Rorty saw as its unlovely offspring. What arouses passion, I think, is the consequent rejection of the very idea of objective reality as what it is the point of our practices to represent, which Rorty sees as following from his critique of the semantic concept of representation, on behalf, remember, of the ideals of reason, freedom, and democracy. Further, when we jettison that idea, along with it, he thinks, must go the idea of our cognitive practices as rational in the specific sense that essentially incorporates the goal of fidelity to the objective attitude-independent facts. Rorty does so on behalf of a humanized, non-representational conception of rationality as consisting in responsiveness to reasons, not to be confused with the merely causal constraint on our conduct exercised by our non-human environment, which he never for a minute doubted. From the point of view of his critics, however, it's bad enough that in place of the lofty ideal of science as a practical method for getting it right concerning how things anyway are, Rorty wanted to put a purposely low-key notion of coping, or as he sometimes says, muddling through. But when he further construes giving and asking for reasons, assessing evidence, justifications, and explanations as all ultimately and ineluctably a matter of politics, his strong reading of William James' claim that the trail of the human serpent is over all, then the gauntlet has been thrown down and battle joined. At this point, the Deweyan insistence that what's envisaged is democratic politics, defining ourselves by the result of exercises of our freedom to give and ask each other for reasons, is unlikely to reassure or change minds. This, the critics claim, is gross, dangerous irrationalism. I think there are weighty considerations available on this side of the dialectic. For it can be claimed that Rorty recklessly proposes to sacrifice one of the most precious legacies of the actual Enlightenment, an appreciation of natural science as the very form of knowledge, as the disinterested pursuit of truth by the impartial assessment of reasons grounded in empirical evidence and answerable to how things really objectively anyway are. The sharp contrast between this cognitive scientific enterprise and every sort of merely political wrangling can be thought of as the essential insight of the Enlightenment. The correctness of its realistic, objectivist, theoretical understanding of both empirical science and the world it seeks rationally to comprehend is vouched for daily by the practical success of its technological arm, the engine of the Industrial Revolution, which has made natural science the most staggeringly successful social institution of the last 300 years. And at this point, the stage is set for both assessing Rorty's argument on the model of modus tollens rather than modus ponens, and for using one's attitude towards it as a touchstone for assessing one's philosophical temperament as tough or tender-minded, or even as hard or soft-headed. But if one rejects Rorty's conclusion, whether because of its consequences or simply because one cannot deal with its outrageous radicality, one then owes a diagnosis of where the argument for it has gone astray. Where exactly does the analogy between the anti-authoritarianism of the First Enlightenment on practical matters and the anti-authoritarianism of Rorty's projected Second Enlightenment on cognitive matters break down? As I've reconstructed it, the two pillars supporting Rorty's final global anti-representationalist argument are the normative construal of representational relations as essentially involving the authority of representeds over what count as representings of them, just in virtue of their responsibility to those representeds, which serve as standards for assessment of the correctness of those representings, on the one hand, and the social pragmatism about norms that consists in understanding all normative statuses, paradigmatically authority and responsibility, as conferred by or consisting in roles in social practices. I take it that both of those express genuine and important insights, the first Kantian and the second Hegelian. But I also think that a closer look at these two ideas opens up room for a non-fetishistic view that's friendlier to the conception of representation, and so more like the one I was championing in the Girona three-way that I described than the one Rorty was defending. In particular, I think it's possible to understand empirical discursive commitments as representing objective facts, to understand representational relations those commitments stand in to what's represented as essentially and not just accidentally a normative matter of authority and responsibility, and to understand those normative statuses as instituted by social practices. And further, I think Hegel himself shows us in detail how to do that. The basic issue, I think, is how to understand social pragmatism about norms. The underlying idea is that normative statuses are ultimately social statuses. Normative significances, such as having authority or being responsible, are instituted or conferred by playing a distinctive kind of role in social practices. I endorse that Enlightenment idea, which both Hegel and the Wittgenstein of the investigations, each in his own way, developed and exploited, as indeed I would argue did the Heidegger of Division 1 of Being and Time. Drawing Rorty's conclusion requires a stronger version of the idea, though. For Rorty takes it that it follows from social pragmatism about norms, in this sense, that nothing non-human can exercise authority over us, that we can't be responsible to any non-human authority. His reason, I think, is that discursive authority and responsibility are rational authority and responsibility, in the sense of being normative statuses that matter for practices of giving and asking for reasons. What doesn't make a difference for those practices of giving and asking for reasons is semantically inert and epistemically irrelevant. And it is a key Enlightenment insight, emphasized, distilled, and developed in Kant's critical philosophy, that authority, to be genuine, must be rational authority. It's genuine normative authority only insofar as it involves a correlative justificatory responsibility, a responsibility to provide reasons for exercising that authority in the way or on one that one does, or on one occasion rather than another. Rorty thinks that nothing that cannot fulfill that justificatory responsibility should be understood to exercise genuine authority within and according to our reason-giving practices. We should acknowledge the authority only of what we can critically interrogate as to its reasons. He concludes that only parties to our conversations, only participants in our practices can have normative statuses. In the end, the only authority we ought to recognize, Rorty thinks, is each other, those to whom we owe reasons for our commitments, and those who owe such justifying reasons to us for their exercise of authority. Rational authority involves a correlative justificatory responsibility. To attribute such normative statuses to anything that can't talk back is to fetishize. It's for this reason that the supposed authority of a non-human God and a non-human represented reality are alike condemned as ultimately irrational, fetishistic remnants of traditional conceptions, which it's the task the privilege, and the glory of enlightenment to sweep away. It shows how little many of his critics have understood Rorty's argument that a principal charge in their indictment of him is his supposed irrationalism, because it's precisely his devotion to reason that drives this whole line of thought. He's trying to think through rigorously what reason is and what it requires of us. At the basis of this argument is a new principle, which builds on but goes beyond social pragmatism about normative statuses. Its slogan is, no genuine authority without rational responsibility. And I think there's something deeply right about it. Some version of this thought is central not only to Kant's understanding of us discursive beings as essentially autonomous, but also to what Hegel made of that autonomy idea. For Kant, the basic normative status, our dignity as autonomous, which others are obliged practically to respect, is having the authority to make ourselves responsible, to commit ourselves. And committing ourselves, making ourselves responsible cognitively to how things are is judging, endorsing a proposition. And committing ourselves, making ourselves responsible practically to how things are to be is willing or intending. For Kant, endorsing a practical maxim or principle. And among the things one always makes oneself responsible for doing by exercising discursive authority of either the cognitive or the practical variety is providing reasons that justify undertaking or acknowledging the commitments one does. Exercising one's authority as autonomous makes one vulnerable to assessments of one's reasons for those exercises. And I think it's more than a little ironic that when Rorty later sought arguments for the global anti-representationalism he'd first defended in Mirror, he turned to Kant, the arch-representationalist villain of that book. But what he turned to is one key principle animating Kant's political liberalism, forging a connection between legitimate authority, the responsibility for reasoned justification, and democracy that Rorty wholeheartedly applauds in the form that Dewey gave to it. The later Rorty is entirely comfortable with mounting an argument against semantic representationalism and the conception of epistemically authoritative represented reality that it articulates, that's ultimately a political argument, even if it relies on ideas whose credentials can be traced back to Kant. As I'm reconstructing Rorty's argument, two of the three principal premises of his anti-authoritarian argument for global anti-representationalism and his rejection of the idea of reality as the object of representation that it involves are due ultimately to Kant. The normative analysis of representational relations and the idea that genuine authority involves a correlative responsibility to be responsive to critical demands for reasons. The third pole in the tripod, social pragmatism about normative statuses, such as authority and responsibility, I think of as introduced by Hegel rather than by Kant. And I think Kant is right that the most basic sort of normative status is a kind of authority that's rational in that it essentially involves correlative justificatory responsibility. Unless there were normative statuses of this sort, there would be no norms at all. But I don't think it follows that all authority has to be of this fundamental kind. Once implicitly normative social practices are up and running, derivative sorts of normative statuses, parasitic on the basic ones that characterize discursive practitioners, become possible and intelligible. It's true that as social pragmatism about normative statuses has it, it's only in virtue of playing a suitable role in social practices that anything acquires specifically normative significance. And it's true that those practices must include the special kind of role practitioners can play, in virtue of which they have the authority to commit themselves, to make themselves responsible to each other. Among other things, but essentially responsible for giving each other reasons, justifying the commitments they've undertaken by exercising their authority. But in the context of discursive practices that include the kinds of authority characteristic of us as reason-giving and assessing participants, those interlocutors can confer other parasitic sorts of normative significance on things that are not themselves capable of giving and asking for reasons. For a simple example, consider omens and oracles. A community can have practices according to which if a flock of black birds flies over the group, that's deciding whether to undertake a momentous, risky action, planting the crops earlier rather than later, making or breaking an alliance, moving the tribe to a new location, that natural event is accorded the normative significance of a bad portent, the decisions made by the flock of birds. It can, in practice, the flock of birds can, in practice, be accorded the authority to prohibit the course of action in question. It only has that normative significance in virtue of the practical attitudes of the community members who make it authoritative by taking it to be authoritative, by treating it as an ominous sign. There's nothing mysterious about how natural occurrences can come to be accorded such significances. Even if the practitioners themselves are fetishists in their meta-attitudes, in that they deny the efficacy of their own practices in instituting the normative significance in question, taking it to be an objective, broadly natural or supernatural matter of fact, nonetheless, we can see that they do, in fact, confer that normative significance by how they treat natural events of this kind, just as social pragmatism about norms claims. They're acting so as to grant authority over their own decisions to the occurrence or non-occurrence of certain natural phenomena. And although the practitioners must be able to offer and ask for reasons, each other for reasons for their commitments, for instance, to cite the appearance of the birds as a reason not to break the treaty, it need not be possible to ask the birds for reasons for exercising the authority that's been attributed to their behavior. There need be nothing that counts as holding the birds responsible for the decision that their behavior authorized or prohibited in order for their authority to be intelligible as socially instituted or imputed. Social pragmatism about norms says the practices of the community are the fons et origo from which all normative significance flows. But that's compatible with those practices conferring normative significances, for instance, the state of having authority, on things other than the reason-mongering community members whose practices they are. And though the authority of those practitioners to participate in the practices that confer such significances essentially and not just accidentally involves correlative responsibilities, including those that involve liability to demands for reasons for their exercise of that authority, the same just need not hold of all the items to which they attribute normative significance, including various kinds of authority over the aspects of their practices. Think of the naval principle, no rum while the sun's over the yardarm. The three principles I've excavated on the basis of Rorty's argument, when properly understood, leave room for the possibility that our discursive practices can confer on objective things and occurrences the normative significance of serving as standards for assessment of the correctness of what count as representings of them just in virtue of being, in that sense, responsible for their correctness to how it is objectively is with what thereby counts as represented by them. That's conferring on representeds a distinctive kind of authority over representings. Participants in the practice granting authority over various aspects of that practice to things that are not even candidates for first-class status as participants, in virtue of their ineligibility as reason givers, might in particular cases be unwise, as it surely is for treating the vagaries of birds as action licensing or action prohibiting omens, and as it could well be for letting the sun's position determine when rum rations are due and appropriate. But it's neither unintelligible on social pragmatist grounds, nor incompatible with our dignity as rational members of a democratic polity. The important point remains that non-human things can have only the authority we grant them. I think we're led by these considerations to a problem in social engineering. Once we see that the possibility is not ruled out in principle, we must ask whether there's a structure or configuration of practices that deserve to count as granting to things specifically representational authority over our thought and talk. How should we understand such authority? And what exactly do we need to do to institute or confer it on things we will then qualify as thinking and talking about? More pointedly, can we make sense of our attitudes as having representational content in a way that grants authority over their correctness to how things anyway are, where anyway means independence in some sense of our attitudes, including those that instituted the normative representational relations in the first place. For on the normative tripartite ontological sorting of things into subjective, social, and objective that emerged from Rorty's arguments for eliminative materialism, to represent objective things is to represent things about whose properties neither individual attitudes nor community attitudes are finally authoritative. Rather, authority must be granted to, practically taken to reside in, and be exercised by the things themselves. Explaining how that possibility, which I've argued is left open in principle by the three principles on which Rorty's representationalism is fetishism argument against the very idea of objective reality is based, explaining how that possibility can actually be recognized in practice is a tall order and a hard job. But I think Hegel offers just such an account. He subscribes to, and his account respects and accords with, all three of the principles that Rorty invokes: social pragmatism about norms, the idea that representational relations between representeds and representings must be understood in normative terms of authority and responsibility, and an understanding of the most basic normative statuses as necessarily involving correlative authority and rational responsibility. In my second lecture, I'll explain how I think Hegel's story about the institution of normative representational relations goes. At the heart of his explanation is the idea that the relations between norms, normative statuses such as authority and responsibility, and the normative attitudes that both institute and answer to those norms is essentially historical. In the end, I want to claim Rorty didn't follow this line of thought all the way through to its proper conclusion, because he, following Dewey, did not sufficiently appreciate the thoroughgoing nature of Hegel's historicism and the remarkable and distinctive conception of specifically recollective rationality that it articulates. That'll be my topic, the topic of my next lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We just decided that we are going to extend the session a little because we've only got 8 minutes left to 9, and Christian Skirky is now going to chair the discussion and collect the questions in the Q&A. Everybody should write their question in the Q&A function together with Daniel Loic.
Okay, thank you.
Very much. Yeah.
We should send you instructions in the chat, and we'll proceed now with the first question that we've got. Let me just read. Is not the really urgent need for a third enlightenment the escape from the current tyranny of the uninformed, diffuse utilitarian authoritarianism of the democratic majority, untrained in sound reason-giving practices? Did Rorty genuinely believe that kind of blind authoritarianism is really better than the ancient poetic authority of the prophets and poets, of the wise, or of the analytic authority of the metaphysicists who take their lives more seriously? Now, Professor Brandom.
Yes, well, Rorty describes himself as becoming disillusioned on this point, that in the 50s and 60s and on into the 70s, that he thought, looking particularly at the American political situation, that Dewey's hopes for democracy and the effective rational discussion were more or less being fulfilled as more liberal legislation came on hand. And that with the swing backwards, beginning in the 1980s, he felt he had been betrayed, that his confidence that things were as Dewey had described them, that we could count on practices of giving and asking for reasons in a liberal democratic polity as having a generally progressive liberalizing effect, that his hopes about that had been dashed, and that the permission he felt he had been given by the way things were going politically to devote his life to scholarship and his personal interests rather than politically, that he'd been misled in that regard. So we see in his latest political writings, indeed, a concern with the irrationalism of mob authority and the de-emphasis and, to a certain extent, powerlessness of that peculiar force of the better reason that so fascinated and puzzled the ancient Greeks. So I think indeed he was sensitive to those concerns.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm just going to read the next question. This anonymous viewer says they are having trouble connecting some dots. I'm just going to ask you to help them. Rorty sees the distinction between mind and matter as rooted in the first-person authority over direct experience, which is determined by social practices. Is rationality likewise rooted in social practices? And how does this first-person authority over experience relate to Rorty's rejection of the notion of experience?
Yeah, good. Rorty distinguishes between sentience and sapience, and thinks that Descartes, one of the things that was not progressive about Descartes was putting sapient episodes of thoughts in a box with things like raw feels and pains as having this incorrigibility that goes at most with sentience. What's a reason for what isn't something we have, that individuals have this Cartesian sort of authority over? But it also isn't a matter of our being subjected to some antecedent notion of rationality that we might radically get wrong. Any such picture of rationality, for instance, the picture of rationality as maximization of expected utility, all presupposes a pre-Quinean picture according to which meanings are all fixed in advance of our worrying about what's a reason for what. So that we can then ask, well, given that these things mean this, surely it isn't up to us which ones of them are reasons for which other ones. But the Quinean picture that Rorty had been so impressed by says there isn't this two-phase process, first where we fix the meanings, and second, when we decide what's true, what follows from what's justification, what's a reason for what. All we do is take or treat some noises as reasons for others, and that confers content on them and settles which of these stand in reason relations to one another. So our meaning conferring process is at the same time the imposition of the sort of structure of reason on the noises and performances that we produce for each other. So what's a reason for what is a matter of social practice. But I mean, I mentioned that Rorty's resistance to the notion of reality is of reality as the representational authority over our knowledge claims, not as causally constraining us. And he liked a story that is ultimately due to Sellers about a toy practice of using a notion of an acid, where we take something tasting sour as being a reason for calling it an acid, and take something being an acid as a reason for its turning litmus paper red. And now the world can come in and give us something that tastes sour and turns litmus paper blue, now by our own norms, the norms we've conferred on these noises. We've contradicted ourselves. We can infer that the litmus paper is red, and we can see that the litmus paper is blue. That's the world causally telling us we can't have that concept. That's committing ourselves to inference relations that don't hold. We're constrained in our practices by those causal inputs of the world, but the authority is instituted by the role they play in our practices, the meanings we've conferred.
Thank you. I have here two questions, one by Pierre-François Moureau and another one by Alfredo Vernazzani. One concerns the relation between Rorty's position and sociology, the other one between Rorty's position and logic. So the first one concerns the idea that pragmatism, understood philosophically and in the way in which Rorty understands it, which connection might it have with a pragmatist understanding of sociology? And the other question is pretty much the same for the question of how the normative dimension in social practices is governed not just by an interplay of reason giving, but has to do with further rules like the laws of logic.
Okay, well, I think these are actually pulling in quite different directions. Rorty said, he thought the lesson that we had collectively learned by about the end of the 19th century was that a great deal of what we had thought required philosophical explanation and investigation, in fact, required sociological and historical investigation and explanation, and that intellectual history and sociology between them could do a lot of the work that philosophers have been called on to do. I mentioned that he ruse the philosophical imagination of Russell and Husserl in pulling us back from that. And as far as Rorty was concerned, wasting basically a century in taking a detour from where he wanted to bring us back to. On logic, Rorty's own view was as skeptical of the philosophical significance of logic as it's possible to be. He once said that he didn't think any thought of philosophical significance had ever taken place within 6 feet in any direction of a quantifier symbol. That was his understanding of it. My own view is that that's not, that view is not entailed by his pragmatism, but we should see logic not as setting down a set of rules that constrain what's a reason for what, but principally see logical vocabulary and the concepts it expresses as giving us tools for expressing reason relations. So for me, the paradigm of a logical, of a bit of logical vocabulary is the conditional that lets us say that there's a relation of implication, a reason relation between the antecedent and the consequent, or negation that lets us say that one claim is a reason against another claim, that it's incompatible with it. So I see an expressivist view about the rules of logic, where we introduce vocabulary to make explicit what's implicit and meaning conferring in our use of non-logical vocabulary. So I think there's room for a pragmatist view about the norms of logic, but those are expressive. That's an expressive view about logic, not one in which logic is antecedent to material reasoning practices.
Thank you. Yeah, and unfortunately, we are almost at the end of our time, but I have 2 more questions that I will take together. And then that's it for today. And everybody else can ask the question next week. So the 2 questions for today are both about the notion of the second enlightenment. And one is by Navid Rashidian. And the question is, how do you think that this idea or the concept of the second enlightenment goes in societies with pre-modern autocracies or a rule of tradition? Is it possible to go from a pre-modern society directly into the second enlightenment, or do they have to accept first some enlightenment version of objective morality? That is the first question. The second question about the second enlightenment is by Josef Früchtel, He asks how this notion, or this Rorty that you reconstructed today, the Rorty who doesn't accept any authority outside of practices, how this relates to another Rorty that is from the contingency book, who is very critical about rational justification and tells us that interesting philosophy is not about the pros and cons of a thesis, but about making a new vocabulary attractive by showing us what we can do with it.
Okay, very good. Well, Rorty did think that we need the first Enlightenment in order to have the second, that pre-modern traditional societies that still fetishize norms, that still see norms as to be read off of the way things anyway are, and that our job is to conform our attitudes towards the norms that are set naturally or supernaturally. That transformation, the transformation that Hegel is the great theorist of, the transformation from traditional to modern society, that on the theoretical side appreciates this lesson and then institutionalizes that appreciation. He always thought that was a presupposition for the second Enlightenment that he's recommending. As to the first, Rorty thinks that by giving and asking for reasons, we institute meanings. And he became fascinated, particularly in the period of contingency, irony, and solidarity, by the kind of power of self-transformation that redescription gives us, that remaking meanings gives us. And here his view is rationality is something that happens within a set of reason-giving practices, within a vocabulary. And the shift from one vocabulary to another is essentially never a rational shift. That's the one that he's saying, well, we've got to look at changes of fashion of the sort that he thought took analytic philosophy of his time from the anti-modal Quinean view to the pro-modal Kripkean view. So that was not done for reasons. That was just a matter of fashion. And he thought, again, of Hegel as having seen human development as consisting of the maturation of one vocabulary and then its breakdown and transition to another vocabulary. And that the mechanisms of rationality that happen within those frameworks is quite different from the mechanisms that govern the transition. Now, I actually have a somewhat different view about what's going on in Hegel there, which I'll talk about next time under the heading of recollective rationality.
Thank you very much, Professor Brandom, for a really rich and stimulating and also occasionally fun lecture. And I'm very much looking at, sure everybody else is, to the next lecture, which will take place next Thursday, the 29th of April. And the title is Hegel's Recollective Account of Representation. As you see, we will do the same format with questions and answers next week as well. So if you want to ask a question, you should probably start asking it right at the beginning of Professor Brandom's talk. Thank you so much also for bearing with us for such a long time. And I'll see you next week. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye. Bye, everybody.